Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Nyama, Wanjari Woirangulyin, Gunganinu Bik Wenop Darabandari, Nyariana Nyanga Bik Ban Ba Nyagu, Gagukan Nangit Bambuth Yellingbu Ba Gamaji. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people on whose land Darebin Council stands. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I would like to acknowledge that we have some members of the gallery who are actually sitting just outside of the chamber. This is so that we can adhere to the physical distancing requirements, but I do note your presence if you're sitting outside, and we will hear from you if you are listed as one of the speakers for any of the matters on the agenda tonight. Membership of this meeting is as listed in the agenda. We do have apologies from Councillor Kim Lasserve. Councillor Tim Lawrence is on an approved leave of absence. Councillors, does anyone have a conflict of interest to disclose this evening? No, there being none, we'll continue. That brings us to confirmation of the minutes of the Planning Committee. That's moved by Councillor Greco, seconded by Councillor Williams. Thank you. All those in favour? That motion is carried. That now brings us to consideration of reports. Before we get into those reports, I would like to remind councillors that this is our first meeting where the new governance local laws apply. In keeping with those local laws, questions aren't permitted once debate has commenced. If there is an amendment before we commence debate on any amendment, questions will be allowed. So that's just a reminder now, and we will start by hearing from the officers on the first planning application, which is the amendment of a development plan for 198 Beavers Road. Thank you to the team.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. Yeah, the first item tonight involves a development proposal at 198 Beavers Road in Northcote. This is a substantial site of some 12,000 square metres that is earmarked for substantial housing change. The purpose of the project at hand is, in fact, an amendment to an approved development plan. Already on foot we have a development plan that Council approved, which allows the development of 140 dwellings on the site, comprising a mix of apartments and townhouses with a basement. What we have now is a new ownership, and that new ownership no longer wishes to pursue that approved development plan. They have different ideas for the site. So they have lodged with Council an amendment which comprises 74 dwellings, or the ability to build 74 dwellings, but in a townhouse configuration only, without a basement. So the impact of that is we have obviously less dwellings. The height is also reduced, so it's a mixture of 2 and 3 storey dwellings, as opposed to the up to 4 storey development of the previous applicant. And we have less car parking and conversely less traffic to and from the site as a result. So the dwellings envisaged in a set of plans that were provided to Council at a pre-application stage do not form part of this amendment, but nonetheless inform us of the type of development that is envisaged, which, as I said, is 74 dwellings. 66 of those would be 3-bedroom and 8 would be 2-bedroom, and there'd be a full complement of car parking provided. And that is it in summary. And we did receive one, in response to the notification, one response to the revised development plan.
Thank you for that summary. Councillors, I don't have anyone listed to speak to this item. I'll just confirm that's correct. There's no one to speak? No.
That's correct.
So I'll ask if anyone has any questions. Yes, Councillor Amir.
Through you, Mayor Rennie. Given this is an unusual situation where they're seeking a reduction in density rather than an increase, I was wondering if we get a comment through you to the officers around the implications, I suppose, from a policy or that regional perspective around having a significant decrease in the number of houses or dwellings on the site.
Thank you for that question,
consistent.
Councillor O'Meara. I'll ask that the officers answer it. Thank you.
As I mentioned, it is an area that is highlighted for substantial housing change. So you've got the site adjacent at number 200, which is near completion, which is a similar development to this one. And then you've got other sites in the commercial zone on the opposite side of Beavers Road, which again are in a substantial housing change area. But I think although there is a reduction in the number of dwellings, 74 dwellings is still a good number for this site, a comfortable fit for this site. And combined with other sites, particularly on the other side of Beavers Road, which have the ability to built to a much higher density, I think the provision of 74 dwellings represents a good outcome for that site and that area, which obviously together in totality will accommodate a very substantial number of new dwellings in the future.
Great. Thank you. Are there any further questions? No? I'll ask if anyone has a motion. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor. Chair, I should say, in Planning Committee. I've got a motion which is similar to the one listed in the officer's report, but with an additional point 7, which I'll read out for councillors. I think it also is available to the minute takers as well. To add point 7, pedestrian access only, no vehicle access in brackets, for the access way located between Block B and Block C. The access shall be finished in appropriate paving and landscaping to maximise the use of the space for pedestrians and to maximise outlook from the adjacent dwellings.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Is there a seconder for that motion? Councillor Newton? Councillors, are there any questions before we commence debate? No. Councillor McCarthy, over to you.
Sorry, I think that's slightly different to what I've got here, but that wording is fine. So,
okay,
so that's fine. Am I standing here?
I thought you could sit. You can sit in the planning meeting.
You're sitting.
We'll double check, but while we're checking, you may commence, and we'll.
Thank you. I'll commence, and thank you also to our officers. I welcome the amended plans, and having had an opportunity to go through them in detail prior to this meeting, it's clear that the applicant, or the new owners, I should say, in looking at a variation, have sought to try to obviously deliver a product which is going to be presumably appropriate and attractive to the market, but also delivers a quality of housing which I think we'd welcome here. The one caveat I would say is that townhouse developments in and of themselves don't necessarily provide for better disability access, and I would say that is probably one issue which apartments can provide for, and so the loss of that did raise some concerns in my mind. However, in terms of the general layout of the site, the way in which the site has been thought about being not only its own site but also as far as possible integrated with the surrounding community is really important. And I wanted to highlight the fact that this site actually, if it is supported in the way that's proposed, does open up opportunities for movement for the broader community to actually move from other parts of that neighbourhood to the new Beavers Bridge location, which, as I know, has been a major issue for local residents in terms of their concerns about this site and its configuration. I've included point 7 as an additional point, following consultation with councillors and officers around this, and I acknowledge the Mayor's initiative in regard to thinking through the site as well, because the actual section of road between blocks B and C is actually redundant. There's no need for it to be a road or a section of the site which actually has vehicles moving through. It provides a really unique opportunity because of the size of this site to provide an active transport section on this site and to really build I suppose, a gathering place and a heart for the site as well. So I hope councillors can, planning committee members can support that additional point. It also doesn't impact really in any way on the parking and traffic movement provisions. That's been checked by our officers in terms of having that variation, and really does set this up more as a neighbourhood rather than just a development. I support the variations to the plans, and I would just note that this has not attracted opposition from the local community, which is also great to see. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor McCarthy. I'll now move to the seconder. We've double-checked in the meantime, and it is a requirement that councillors stand. So, Councillor Newton, thank you.
Wow, okay. Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So I really agree with what Councillor McCarthy has said. I think this is a good use of the site, and it's one of the ones where I know this is just sort of an amendment or adjustment to what we had before, and quite a big one. But I think that I can see how this could be actually quite a lovely development, and it's going to have a cafe. It's going to be, I think, somewhere where people would like to live. So very happy to support this one.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Are there further speakers? There being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. Thank you. That brings us to the next item on the agenda, which is item 5.2. This is the application for a planning permit for 10 Benambra Street, Preston. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Rennie. Yeah, this item is for a medium density housing development. It comprises 7 double-storey dwellings over a basement. There are 3 3-bedroom dwellings and 4 2-bedroom dwellings on the proposed. The site has an area of just under 1,000 square metres, and the site is in a general residential zone. Benambra Street itself comprises roughly 30 properties of varying ages and styles. You'll notice in the street there are some recent infill development together with more early 60s and 70s single-storey infill development together with older dwellings from the Victorian, Edwardian and bungalow-style dwellings. The development is recommended for approval subject to conditions. It has been referred to officers of council, including council's city architect, who recently recommended changes to the plans, not wholesale changes certainly, but changes to the design and the look of the dwellings, particularly the dwellings fronting the street. Those changes were agreed and form the plans that are being decided upon tonight. In response to the development, there were 14 objections, and those objections have been discussed and looked at in the report, and it's considered the development responds well to the context and is on that basis recommended for approval subject to the conditions.
Thank you for that summary. We have 2 objectors listed to speak tonight, Mr. Andrew Robertson and Mr. Peter Robertson. I'll invite those objectors in. Thank you. If you could just state your name for the record, and as there are 2 objectors, you'll both have 2.5 minutes to speak. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. My name is Andrew Robertson and I live with my mother Wendy Robertson, who resides at 8 Penambra Street and has lived there for over 45 years. I speak on her behalf and 6 other nearby residents. Unfortunately, due to social distancing, we've not been able to meet collectively, which would have been our preference to give a joint response. I'd like to also acknowledge Councillor Amir, who met with us back in November, and also Councillor Williams, who spoke with us on the phone. Firstly, I'd like to make the point that we've received no communication from the owner of 10 Penambra Street prior to the submission of the development. The owner resides in another state, and this, coupled with the desire to maximise the profit, are probably the reasons why there's a lack of sympathy for the local area that this proposal demonstrates. The 3 key objections we make are it's an overdevelopment of the site, the underground car park and the loss of residential amenity for the neighbourhood, and the precedent for future developments in residential streets across the municipality if this is approved. So our first objection is that the proposal of 7 dwellings is clearly too large. It is a development based solely on maximising profit without consideration of the character of the surrounding neighbourhood. No similar scale development exists in Penambra Street or any adjoining streets. The nearest in-progress developments are at 1 Grampian Street, which comprises 7 dwellings, but borders on a right-of-way, so there's no underground car park, and the Gilbert and May development, which has 14 dwellings, but it's spread across 3 blocks, and again, there is no underground car park. The most recently completed developments are 32 Tynant Street on the corner of Penambra Street opposite our property, which is 3 sets of double-storey units, and 17 Penambra Street on the corner of Charles Street, which is another set of 3 double-storey units. These later 2 developments are definitely in keeping with the surrounding area. I would question the planning officer's comments that the surrounding neighbourhood does not demonstrate elements of an intact neighbourhood by noting that there are no multi-resident properties with underground car parking. The only reason we have underground parking is to maximise the size of the development. So objection 2 is the car park. There's a minimum clearance of 2.2 metres. Okay. Every car will be required to complete a 3-point manoeuvre for parking. The planning officer's comments that the overflow parking would be within reasonable limits and will not negatively impact the surrounding streets is worthy of scrutiny. It is doubtful people will take their SUVs and family sedans down a steep incline and park when it is far simpler to leave their cars on the streets. No vehicles with roof racks or roof storage will be able to enter the car park. Significant on-street parking already fills Penambra Street, and this will be increased with the development. There is also no traffic study to support the assertion that there will only be an incremental increase in traffic. Notwithstanding the above, the practicalities of excavating to build an underground car park is a structural risk to all surrounding properties. Council should consider the fact that when we get a 1 in 50-year storm, which seems to be happening a lot more often nowadays, water rushes down Tynant Street and pools on Penambra Street. This car park will probably be at risk of flooding if such an event occurs. As for the waste management, I note the requirement for the developer to submit a revised waste management plan, which is not unexpected, and it's noted that there's going to be shared bins because curbside collection would cause traffic and amenity issues. This is only an issue because of the size of the development. For the final objection, the fact is that these apartments are typical off-the-shelf design, quickly constructed and hastily sold for profit. There's not a lot to commend the design in terms of aesthetics. It gets a 0 for innovation on the sustainability report. The market for these properties is those seeking an investment that they finance through negative gearing. Approval by council of this development with an underground car park on a residential street sets a dangerous precedent. And for the avoidance of doubt, we're not opposed to development, and we understand that council should and must support more medium density housing. Melbourne's urban sprawl can't continue indefinitely. We acknowledge the development on 10 Penambra Street is inevitable. However, the project size and the underground parking necessary to achieve 7 dwellings suggests that this development is motivated more by profit and greed, which troubles myself and the surrounding residents.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robertson, and I particularly appreciate you coming along in what are not ordinary circumstances tonight. So thank you for taking the time to come and speak with us. Councillors, there is no applicant who's listed to speak tonight, so it's now over to you if you have any questions. Yes, Councillor Greco?
I just had a question in relation to private open space, if we can get some comments from our officers in regards to that.
Certainly, thank you, Councillor Greco. Over to the officers.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Yeah, in the report on page, you've got a table of what is the open space provision for the dwellings. So for dwelling 1, they've got up to 29 square metres of the secluded private open space, which is principally the rear yard of that property, which is away from the street. Dwelling 2, similarly, is 32 square metres. And then for dwellings 3 to 6, they're up to 37 square metres. And the final dwelling has 65 square metres. In addition, there is a front garden in front of dwellings 1 and 2, which isn't included in those calculations. So those areas do comply with the planning scheme, which seeks 25 square metres of secluded private open space. So dwellings 1 and 2 are near to that. The remainder are comfortably above that figure.
Thank you for that response. Further questions? Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a question about flora and fauna. So having a look at Street View, it looks like there's a pretty nice tree on the nature strip and it's really beautiful and green at the front. But I see in the plans the driveway goes through the middle. I was just wondering if you could comment more on if you're satisfied with that response.
Yeah, sure. That is an issue we do deal with, and that's something we referred to our team in the open space unit. So they've looked at that and determined that the tree could be removed, providing adequate replacement planting is provided on the street to offset the loss of the street tree.
Thank you for that. Councillors, further questions? Councillor Amir.
Sorry. Through you, Mayor Rennie. My question was about flooding, and I note in the report it says that it's not located in the flood zone. However, I do know from talking to residents that there is a lot of flooding that occurs in West Preston and West Thornbury. So even though it may not be in a flood zone, it is near a flood zone. So I was wondering if there was any further information available around the flow of the expected flow of the water in a flooding situation, or the lay of the land that might provide further information about the risk of the flooding of the car park should a flood occur, because we do know that in large parts of West Preston that water tends to run over the ground towards Merry Creek and then down into the creek. So I was wondering if there was any further information on that.
Thank you, Councillor Amir.
Yes, that's more of a... Thank you, Councillor Amir. No, that's more of an engineering type of a question that's not fully resolved at this planning stage, but true, at the engineering stage, detailed plans will have to be provided to our engineers to determine how water flows from rain events onto the site and other events are dealt with in the event the site floods or in the event there's a massive rainfall event. And, you know, typically with these developments there are on-site detention systems to hold water before being released into the street's drains. I'd imagine a similar approach would be required for any typical basement design to ensure residents aren't disadvantaged in those events.
Thank you. Councillor Williams.
I have a proposal for an alternative motion.
Can I just check first, Councillor Williams, whether there are any further questions? No. So, Councillor Williams?
I have an alternative recommendation that Council refuse the application on the following grounds, which should come up on the screen. The proposal fails to satisfy the objectives of clause 22.04, that the proposal does not comply with the standards objective of clause 55 of the Darebin Planning Scheme, in particular clause 55.02-1 of the neighbourhood character, the residential policy, the building height, and 55.03-1, the streetscape. The front setback does not comply, and 55.04-1, the side and rear setbacks, is inadequate. Side setbacks resulting in visual bulk to the neighbouring residential properties, and clause 55.05-5, the solar access open space, dwelling 6, fails to achieve this standard, resulting in a poor level of amenity.
Thank you for that motion, Councillor Williams. Is there a second for that motion? Councillor Messina. Before we begin debate, I'll ask if anyone has any questions in relation to that. No? Councillor Williams, over to you. You have 3 minutes.
It's pretty clear if we have 14 objections, which clearly shows that this application has quite a lot of impacts with on the neighbouring residents in our neighbourhood and its character. It's great that the developer actually has dwellings of 3 bedrooms, which is great to see. But looking around in the street, it clearly shows it's an overdevelopment. And looking around in the street, that there's no other development of this scale anywhere nearby. It's important that we do look after our future community and exactly what's being built in the future and what we consider as standards, even though it's possibly what people feel that it's something that we look forward to is this type of development. But at this point in time, I don't think that this particular development is right for this site at this point in time.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Councillor Messina.
Thank you. Through the Mayor. Sorry, I haven't got my glasses on. Apologies. Benamba Street is an unusual wide street for that area of Preston, and it has a certain character and appeal. And Councillor Amir and I went there a few months ago, and we undertook our own audit before we spoke to the residents. An audit where we wore our own individual lenses, and what I did not see in that particular area was similar developments where we would see those underground car parks. Planning is a set of guidelines and rules, and what it does is set out the minimum standards. And sometimes those minimum standards are acceptable, and for me, in this case, those minimum standards are not acceptable for that particular development. I also look at precedents and that assist me when I make my final decisions, and I did not find any precedents in this particular area, so therefore I find overdevelopment in that particular size. Developers look for a return on their investment. As a councillor, I look at the return on investment for the community, and I did not find any. We are serious about development here at council, and appropriate development, so much so that we've employed an architect to help us with those particular planning decisions and wear that other lens. What it's clear to me is that the return on this particular development for the community is not there. And I look also at I want to thank the objectors who came here this evening to speak, and should this not be approved this evening, there is another step, and that is VCAT. And VCAT is another lens, and I urge my fellow councillors to think carefully about this particular development and think if this is a precedence for that particular area, because we don't want to see this in Darebin.
Thank you, Councillor Messina. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be speaking in favour of this motion. When I was looking at this particular application, I was actually quite taken aback by the fact of the number of units that are proposed to be developed on this particular site. It's 1,000 square metres, and we're looking at 7 units on this particular site. The other thing that actually drew me back is in relation to the underground car parking that is proposed for this particular site. We're not talking about a major thoroughfare of Darebin where underground car parking is seen as a suitable solution for the parking. But here we're talking about infill areas right in the heart of the neighbourhood where it's been suggested to have an underground car parking. I think that this may set a precedent in relation to allowing for greater intensity of development over your typical suburban blocks with the underground car parking. The other points that I think are valid in relation to the objectors is the overdevelopment of the site. Clearly, 7 units on 1,000 square metres to me constitutes an overdevelopment, and I think linked with that is the idea of the neighbourhood character. I think it will actually set it goes contrary to the grain of the neighbourhood character of the area where you have seven units on a particular site. I understand that that this particular development is really pushing the envelope on the various standards, but I think all put together, I don't think it's an appropriate development for that type of street in that type of area of Darebin. So I'll be supporting this alternate motion to refuse the application.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Are there any further speakers? Councillor McCarthy.
Thanks, Mayor. Getting used to standing in a planning committee meeting. And Chair, I should say, not Mayor, for the purposes of this meeting. I came into this meeting not sure about where I'd land with this one, and I'm going to support the refusal, largely because of some of the observations made by our objectors who joined us, and I thank them for making the time despite the difficult circumstances. What strikes me with this is that whilst it can be read as being compliant if you want to interpret the rules in certain ways, there are points of non-compliance, and there are certainly points where the boundaries upon which the assessment can be made really have to be stretched. So I thank our officers for their work, but I have to disagree in the sense that where we finally land with this is actually to say that it is having to be conditioned into submission to actually be able to be even on the table. And from my perspective, I've always been a bit concerned when an application has the sorts of issues raised. The issues about parking access, for me, are not a make or break issue, but the reality is that when it comes to an underground parking situation, if it's not convenient, if it's not realistic for people to actually use that, they will park on the street. Now, we have a trigger in place, which is that if we start having people in multi-unit developments parking on streets in this way, as I think would be very likely to occur, that triggers parking restrictions. But that shouldn't be the reason why we do or don't make a decision one way or the other on this. It really comes down to some of those internal amenity issues that we've identified. It comes down to some of the non-compliance points that are listed up there on screen. And I just would end by saying that this needs to go back to the drawing board. It's not ready, it's not appropriate, and a development is inevitable on this site, but not this development.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Are there any further speakers? There being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That motion is carried. The Planning Committee has determined to refuse the planning permit. This decision may be appealed to VCAT. The applicant has 60 days in which to appeal. Thank you, councillors. That's the end of 5.2. We'll now move to item 5.3.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. This application seeks approval for 2 residential buildings and 1 mixed-use building. The site is fairly well known. It's been on the drawing board for a while for proposed development. It has an approved development plan for the Arthurton Road development, which is what it was titled. The site has frontages to Arthurton Road. It's known as number 4 Arthurton Road. It also has a frontage to Elm Street, but that's actually not part of this proposed development. There's frontages to Herbert Street, which is impacted by the proposed development. In the officer's report and the attached plans, you'll see reference to building A, B and D1. Building A is 5 stories, Building B and D1 are both 8 stories. Across the site there is a total of 158 apartments and a basement car park which is over 2 levels and services all 3 buildings. Included in the basement car park is 209 car parking spaces, 218 bike parking spaces, and there are 6 electric vehicle charging stations points. The 158 dwellings include 19 single bedroom, 118 2 bedroom and 21 3 bedroom apartments. Within Building B includes 2 ground floor shops and indoor communal facilities, and this is located on the corner of Herbert and Arthurton Road. All 3 buildings are and have access to communal facilities. Some have rooftop gardens. A feature of the development, which I'll put up on the screen, is and this was one of the things that came out of a consultation with the OVGA. And you'll see here there's the 3 buildings, Building B on the corner there, Building D1, Building A. You'll see that there's a pedestrian walkway connection right through the site. And what that's doing is providing an opportunity for additional plantings, and it provides access to the lobby or the residential lobby of all 3 buildings. As the report sets out, the application results from quite an extensive planning process. The journey began over 10 years ago with a planning scheme amendment and a very involved process through the Northcote Structure Plan. That resulted in a planning scheme amendment that was ultimately approved by the Minister. Council did adopt a recommendation for 5-storey maximum on the site. The Minister in 2011 approved the site with 8-storey maximum. Obviously there are smaller setbacks and lower levels contemplated for Elm Street, where you've got essentially a single-storey aspect on the opposite side of the street. One of the things this site does is that it is proposed to retain the existing warehouse, which you'll see up there, in use while these first 3 buildings are developed. As I mentioned earlier, the development plan and these plans were also considered by the Office of Victorian Government Architect, and there is support for this proposal, and it's resulted in some of the modifications that are now there for your consideration. So the application also benefits from having an approved development plan. What this means is that there is no notice requirements allowed to be undertaken or third-party objection rights or appeal rights. Despite this, someone did discover the application online and has lodged an objection. Now, the situation that places the Planning Committee in Mayor Rennie is, whilst you can look at the objection, you can consider the objection, there are 2 decisions you can make in terms of what way to decide. There's not a choice of a notice of decision in this instance. It's either an approval or a refusal. Strategically, this is a significant site. It is very well located, obviously with good access to Northcote Central, good access to Northcote Station. And one of those reasons, and it was a pivotal element in right back in the planning scheme amendment, was to improve the pedestrian experience and the linkage from High Street to Northcote Station, and to allow that frontage to function with an active frontage. There's a 4-metre setback, and that's been provided in this development, which is provided back to the public space and thoroughfare, and that enables the meaningful activation of that street frontage. So with those things considered and the strategic significance of this site, we think the response is appropriate. It does fit the important context of the site, and accordingly the application is recommended for support, subject to conditions.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. We have the applicant, Ms. Natasha Lindell, listed to speak. I'll invite Ms Liddell in to speak tonight. Welcome. Thank you for coming to address the Planning Committee tonight. You'll have 5 minutes.
Thank you for having me. So I'm Natasha Liddell. I'm the planner at the Meydan Group, which is essentially the parent company for the owner of the site as well as its current occupier, TS Clothing. Thank you for having me here to talk to you this evening as we individually and as part of a global community find our way through the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, I take the need for physical distancing and to stay home as seriously as I'm sure many of you do. Holding these meetings and enabling planning to progress is fundamental to providing for the recovery from the pandemic and preparing for the future. And I'd like to congratulate Council on that, because that's not the response that's been met with every council that we deal with. And this particular development, has just been indicated to you, has been a long time coming, over 10 years. The development plan overlay that provides the framework for the development of the site was put into the planning scheme in 2011. Since then, a number of development plans have been prepared, submitted, considered, revised and resubmitted to Council. As you'll be aware, the current development plan was approved by Council in December 2017, providing clear guidance as to what is acceptable and what is expected on the site, particularly in regard to building heights, mix of uses, environmental performance, streetscape interfaces and pedestrian connections. And the officer recommendation for support this evening identifies that we've met those expectations. Throughout the process, it has been ensured that the development of the site will provide for public benefits through the funding of pedestrian-operated signals and widening of Atherton Road Reserve, which will provide in the future for pedestrian space and ultimately a cycling lane. More recently, actually since the approval of the development plan, Council officers have ensured that the approval also provides for the construction of streetscape improvement works around the site identified by Council in its Streets for People strategy, which was approved, I believe, in 2018. Combined with the redevelopment of the site itself, these infrastructure contributions will provide considerable benefit to the local area. The passage of time has also meant that the development of the site is subject to the state government's apartment design standards. While this has resulted in a reduction of yield in comparison to the original projections for the site, we're proud that the development in many cases exceeds the design standards. Residents will benefit from the resulting high internal amenity, as well as the generous landscaping surrounds in which the 3 distinct but architecturally designed buildings forming Stage 1 will be located. We are, of course, supportive of the officer recommendation to issue a permit for the proposed development. The recommendation is the result of a lengthy but productive discussions which provides for the transformation of a critical component of the Northcote Activity Centre and deliver 156 apartments with a high level of amenity and environmental performance, over $300,000 worth of public infrastructure works, including the much needed signalised pedestrian intersection across Atherton Road, a pedestrian link through the site, which is one of 2 because the development plan provides for the main link to be delivered in Stage 2, and a communal park or play space at ground level that it's in excess of 550 square metres and will be publicly accessible. And that's just Stage 1. As the planner at the Meydan Group, I'd like to extend my thanks to Council officers for their constructive attitude and hard work over many years to ensure the application reaches this point. That's not to say that they've made it easy for us, but they have worked tirelessly to achieve a great outcome for the community. I encourage you to adopt the officer recommendations, noting once again that this provides an opportunity to facilitate a positive transformation of a significant site at a time when we need to be looking for opportunities to ensure that there is both industry and housing once we emerge from this pandemic-induced hibernation. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have on the proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Liddell. We appreciate you coming to speak to us tonight. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers at this point in time? Councillor Messina.
I know this has come to Council many times, but through you, Chair. I'd like to look at the ratios between 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom and 3-bedrooms apartments. Was there any investigation into or any planning. In terms of 118 versus 21, I'm concerned about the ratio between 2 and 3 bedroom apartments, and was there an alternate?
Thank you for that question, Councillor Messina. I'll ask that the officers respond.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, the proportions are actually fairly close to what the Darebin Housing Strategy is looking for in terms of the representation. And in fact, if you look at the demographics of Northcote, there are certainly differences there where the need for 1 and 2 bedroom dwellings is actually greater than it is for family accommodation. But we'd be looking at something different in Reservoir, for instance.
Thank you, Mr Rudd. Councillors, are there further questions? Councillor Greco.
I had a question in regards to the proportion of ground floor communal open space relative to the footprint of the buildings. Can we get some comments in relation to that?
Mr Rudd.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, I'd agree with the permit applicant that one of the things that we're extremely pleased with this development is the amount of ground floor space that has been handed over for communal purposes. The playground's been mentioned. The actual pedestrian space through the site is quite generous, so it's not just providing access to the pedestrian areas, to the lobbies, of the residential sections of the apartments. It's actually providing opportunity for canopy tree plantations, and that's probably something that wasn't, that's been an improvement since the initial and early concepts. There's also, in addition to that, there are ground floor meeting places within some of the buildings themselves, and 2 of the buildings have communal meeting rooms in the residential apartments themselves. So there's a combination, and some of those are linked to the outdoor areas too. So there are these little relief points through the development as well.
Thank you, Mr Rudd. Are there further questions? Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Chair. It's actually just along similar lines, just in relation to the communal open space objective as outlined on page 75. There's reference to things such as barbecue areas and vegetable gardens. I'm just wanting to understand whether they're proposed to be located at ground level or part of the roof terrace component.
Mr Rudd.
Yeah, I think the answer's both. There's certainly vegetable gardens and that located in rooftop plantings. There's also, I've got the diagram up on the screen now. It shows a number of areas. You can see the buildings are coloured. There's a blue, grey and a light brown colour, and then you'll see the other areas where the pedestrian spine is in dark brown, and you can see the tree planting areas, but there's also some communal spaces off those as well. So I'm not sure, in response to Councillor McCarthy's question, whether there's barbecues there, but I think there's one where that is the playground area, and that's connected to an indoor area there. I think there are barbecues proposed in the location there. So it's a good central location.
Yep. It's just
McCarthy.
a supplementary. I asked that question just to understand what our understanding is of what are described as the kind of communal and community facilities. And I'm just interested if I can get an officer comment in relation to how those public spaces will be maintained, how we have proposed to condition those, given that in the future, with public access components here, one of the risks for us as a council is that they aren't maintained to the satisfaction that they might be at the beginning. Does that fall upon the body corporate? What conditions do we have in place to ensure that they are actually usable and public-friendly spaces?
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Mr Rudd.
So one of the things with public usable, I'll say, is that there has to be a level of good surveillance over those spaces. So, and that's something the OVGA or the Office of Victorian Government Architect were particularly focused on in their assessment. So the development certainly achieves that. In terms of its maintenance, Councillor McCarthy's correct. The likelihood is there will be an owners' corporation. This won't be a space the council will be maintaining. So it will be a responsibility of the owners' corporation, and you would expect as part of that the residents there would have a certain amenity expectation they've bought into. And the typical arrangement is the fees are set accordingly to maintain that at a certain standard. These spaces, I don't know whether it's going to be managed after hours or what the situation is with access after hours, but certainly during daylight hours there'll be permeability through the site.
Thank you, Mr Rudd. Councillor Messina.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, I would like to discuss the waste management system. We have 158 dwellings, and I noticed that there was some on item number 61. It actually states that the condition of an approval will require the waste management plan to be revised to reflect the approved number of apartments and shopfront floor area to address food waste. My question is, how is that food waste going to be addressed? Is it food composting, given that there's going to be some gardens, or is it going to be municipal waste collection, or is it through a private contractor? And are we looking at glass and recycling bins as well, especially glass?
Thank you, Councillor Messina. Mr Rudd.
Yeah, I don't have access to that information at the moment, but it's a condition of approval. It's requiring consideration of those matters. I can say though that at the moment there is not a wholesale management system that practically exists to manage food waste for apartments. That condition there is designed to deal with the commercial businesses. So there certainly is an expectation that condition will have in relation to those. Just looking at that particular, there's a discussion on page 61 in the officer's report that relates to the waste management plan and provides a little bit more of an expectation or explanation on that does the food waste rely specifically to the shops. Typically with these developments, they are private waste collection, they're not a council waste collection. And that all gets assessed when the detailed waste management plan comes in as part of the final plans that are considered.
Thank you, Mr Rudd. Are there further questions? Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you. The response to Councillor Messina's question just prompted me to think about Council's role in this in relation to our policy objectives. Given that what we're dealing here with in relation to waste management is a matter of whether or not it complies with the standard and the objective, is there anything that Council could include as a condition that would actually require some of the policy aspirations that Councillor Messina has referred to that may in fact exceed the standard or objective but deliver something closer to the sort of circular economy, closed system approach that behind that question?
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Mr Rudd.
Yeah, so in terms of better sorting, is that through you, Mayor, is that the question, so that there's appropriate sorting and collection so all recyclables can be...
Sorry, Councillor Messina, please.
Just to be clear, just in relation to the food waste component, just to take that, the ability to look at the opportunity for instance, reuse of food waste on site is one example. Obviously, this is not 1,000 apartments, it's 158 or 156. But what are the opportunities there? Could there be a condition that Planning Committee could include in this that would actually strengthen those opportunities on site?
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Mr Rudd.
Thank you for the clarification, Mayor Rennie. That condition, my understanding is that it is looking at that food reuse opportunity. And it's a reasonably new requirement on the waste management plans. It's not something that was there 12 months ago. And certainly Council's emerging policy or policy on that matter has sort of influenced that assessment process. So that expectation is certainly there for the shop businesses, assuming they're food businesses, and there's a likelihood they would be in this particular location.
Thank you, Mr Rudd. Councillor Messina.
Thank you for your answer, but that focuses on the commercial. It doesn't focus on the residential. So I would like to see some tighter restrictions in terms of that with this particular application. Is there something that we can discuss here and now to ensure that that is highlighted and looked in and is considered in the waste management plan?
Thank you, Councillor Messina. Mr Rudd?
Sorry, I'm just reading through the conditioning.
That's okay. I think it's important to take our time
Yep.
to get this right.
Thank
There's
you.
clearly a request from councillors to consider
Yeah.
something that addresses food waste from the residential component of
Yeah.
development.
I guess the difficulty I have with that is that, and I've had a recent conversation with experts on waste management, and they've said that there isn't anything that practically exists that can cater for that type of expectation at this point in time. Even though it's a noble aspiration, it certainly does exist for smaller residential apartment or developments or units, but there isn't the practical means to do so for larger scale developments and apartments. It's possible for a townhouse development, and we intend to apply it for townhouse developments, but not for these large scale developments.
Thank you, Mr Rudd. Councillor Messina?
I have some input through you, Mayor, and through the executive team member, Mrs Olivia, to address that. Is there anything that we can do to address food waste and glass recycling on this particular development?
Thank you. So I've had a request for further information. Ms Olivia, are you able to provide any further clarity?
Through you, Mayor Rennie, certainly my understanding would be that should a private developer seek a service to recycle food waste for something at this scale, that they would be able to secure a service. My question, Darren, would be, what's the planning context of that sort of request?
Look, with all due respect, Mayor Rennie, it's policy on the run, and I don't have anything I can put into in way of a planning precedent. I can sort of say I can legitimately ask for this requirement. I'm confident we can with the glass. That's not a problem, and I understand that's actually occurring with the various waste management plans to ensure that we can dispose or reuse products accordingly. But it is problematic with food waste just on this particular scale. It's certainly possible and practical for smaller developments, but the advice I've got, and I can only rely on the people in our council departments on these particular issues. They're saying at the moment there isn't that sort of stream or ability to be able to do it or provide it through a planning permit condition.
Okay, thank you, Mr Rudd. Councillors, are there further questions? Councillor Greco.
Thank you. Look, I had a question in relation to the aesthetics and the design of the building. Given that it's a significant corner and a significant development, I was just wondering, two related questions. One is that, have we had this particular building and design assessed by the Office of the Victorian Architect? And secondly, has our in-house architect assessed the design and aesthetics of this particular building? And what has been their opinion?
Thank you for those questions, Councillor Greco. Mr Rudd?
Yeah. The Office of Victorian Government Architect are supportive of the design before you, so too is the City Architect. The Office of Victorian Government Architect are supportive of the design, the architectural design that is before you for consideration, so too is the City Architect.
Thank you, Mr Rudd. Councillors, are there further questions? I'll ask if there is a motion. Thank you, Councillor McCarthy.
Thanks, Mayor. I'll move the recommendation as listed with no amendments.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Is there a second for that? Councillor Newton, thank you. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm moving this, and I find it interesting to find ourselves at this point in time where We have an application which has been through so many iterations, I've actually lost track, because I do remember first dealing with this application in its much earlier form when I first arrived on council, and following the long period that our community went through with the Northcote Structure Plan, which in fact set the height limits. I do remember, as has been outlined by our planners and also the applicant's representative, the processes that have gone through and where we arrived, which was actually the minister effectively enforcing an 8-storey height component when council's preference at the time was 5 stories with 3 at the boundaries. However, in saying that, we cannot change that 8-storey height limit. That is not within the remit of this council. It is an approved component at the state level. What we are dealing with here is the detail, and the detail has improved, I would say, considerably compared to where we were a couple of years ago with the previous iteration. So I welcome and thank, in particular, the work of our officers in making some significant changes to what we see before us. Obviously, there are variations to the scale and the shape of the proposal, and we're not dealing with the entire site here. We are dealing with the first stage. In particular, I welcome the inclusion of some public facilities, particularly a pedestrian access route, and also some other minor facilities that may be available to the community during daylight hours. And I recognise that some of the detail isn't there in terms of after hour access, and I would expect it's incumbent upon both the applicant and the body corporate in the future to work out those things, because we do not want to create a location in this city which is dark or unsafe after hours. And so I just signal that some clarity is required there. What we do have before us, though, is what I think is an improved mix in terms of the number of three bedroom apartments, and that's welcome to see 21 of those included, because that delivers an opportunity for more families to live in this part of Northcote, and of course the opportunity to also, with those 2 bedrooms, to see some of that as well. So I was concerned we would see another development predominantly with one bedroom apartments, completely out of step with what our community needs and what the market is also saying. On that basis, I'm prepared to support what we have in front of us here, because it is an improvement on what we previously had. And I suspect that this is not, well, it certainly won't be the last time we deal with this on this planning committee, although I suspect it will be the last time in this term of council. This is a development that's been with us for well over a decade, and I suspect that it will continue to be a matter of great interest in the local community over the decade to come as the plans start to emerge. I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Chair. So this is undoubtedly a big application, but I think it's in the right spot for it. Through the report, it talks about how, you know, there are places in Darwin that need more density. This is one of them. It's a great location near gyms, cafes, restaurants, near the train as well. I'm actually really pleased to see. We don't often see playgrounds in developments, and I think there's a reality that there will be children and families living in this when it's developed. So I was really pleased to see that. I've been thinking a lot about housing since, you know, we're all inside a lot at the moment, and I have a friend that lives in an apartment called Jewel Station over in Brunswick, and it does have some of the features that we're talking about in here. So it's got a rooftop garden. She said there's a lot of downsizes there. So I think a development like this will be good for people who might be in Northcote or Thornby already but want, you know, 1 or 2 bedroom apartment now. She said there's dogs there as well, and that the communal garden it's really maintained by the residents. They've got a Facebook group. It's very active. So, you know, this is another one where I can see how you could really build community there. And I think what's good about this development is that I think what we have in front of us allows for that. So quite pleased to support this one.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Messina.
I'd like to foreshadow an amendment.
You don't foreshadow an amendment. You can put an amendment. You can foreshadow an alternative motion.
Foreshadow an alternative motion with an amendment to this particular motion, please.
Okay, so now would be a good time for that amendment, Councillor Messina.
I'd like to add a particular line on page number 46, item number 15. C, collection of food waste, including and recycling of it maximised to be converted to composting, please.
Okay, Councillor Messina, I'll get you to read out those words again very slowly because they didn't quite make sense to me.
I know they didn't. I just, collection of food waste, including the maximum conversion to composting.
We might try and get those words up, and then I'll ask the mover and the seconder if they accept those. Sorry, Councillor McCarthy, is that acceptable to you?
I'm receptive to it. I would just ask before we confirm the words that we just get a comment from the officers just to confirm that the wording is appropriate in terms of enforceability.
Mr. Rudd?
I think what we're asking for here through you, Mayor Rennie, is just a waste management plan that's asked to consider the reuse of food waste. That's perfectly fine.
Okay. So, Councillor McCarthy, do you accept the amendment?
On that basis, very happy to accept it.
And Councillor Newton?
Happy to accept.
Thank you. That is now the motion in front of us. Are there any further speakers to the motion? No, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That motion is carried. The Planning Committee has determined to grant a planning permit, and I thank once again the applicant for coming to speak to us tonight. We'll now move to item 5.4 on the agenda, which is in relation to Plenty Road. Over to the team to tell us about this one, noting, councillors, that we did have a presentation on this at the last Planning Committee meeting also.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. I'll keep this brief. Again, this is an application that's seeking approval for two 6-storey mixed-use developments that are primarily used for seniors housing, including a retirement village and aged care accommodation. The item was deferred from the Planning Committee meeting of the 10th of March, and that was to enable a consultation meeting to be undertaken and facilitated by officers. Due to recent circumstances, that was unable to be done face-to-face, so that was convened by a teleconference with the consent of all parties. This was conducted on the 19th of March 2020 and unfortunately was unable to achieve any agreement. However, there was some good information exchange between the parties, and we've circulated some details on some of the detailed questions that were raised at the consultation meeting and some of the considerations that were put forward. In the end, we got to a point where the planning permit applicant was unwilling to vary the setback to the objector's requirements, which was to require a strict adherence to the 30-degree setback that is in the design and development overlay. And as such, we were unable to mediate an agreement. So the recommendation before you this evening, with the addition of condition GG, which is asking for food waste to be specifically considered and accommodated in the waste management plan for the retirement and aged care housing. The recommendation is similar to the one put previous to the Planning Committee, and that is for support subject to conditions.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. Councillors, we have heard previously from the applicant and the objector. They have not come tonight, so I will ask if anyone has any questions. Oh, is there? Oh, I apologise. I didn't have that listed. Please come and speak. Welcome, state your name, and you have 5 minutes.
G'day all. Alex Sands is my name. I was here last month and I'm here again. I won't go through all of the technical issues that we spoke about last week, because I'm sure you've all read the various emails and submissions that we've made. I'll be really quick. I just want to say that we're not against the development of the site. We want the site to be developed. We just want it to be consistent with the planning scheme. Even if you accept the planning officer's characterisation of the 30-degree setback as a discretionary requirement, those requirements are there for a reason, right? They're there to protect against, and it says in the scheme, unreasonable impacts on the amenity of the residents to the south of the development. So with that in mind, this decision tonight is a choice between protecting the amenity of the residents to the south through supporting appropriate development, or supporting a private corporation that's trying to maximise its profits by getting as many rooms onto this site as humanly possible. The applicant has said, look, we're not going to compromise on that 30-degree setback. So what they have done effectively is by adopting this uncompromising strategy, is attempting to force you all into a position where you have to either support the development or not support the development. We're saying don't fall for that. Don't let them do that. Don't let you bully you into that position. Say, we support the development, but we want you to tweak it and change it so it doesn't result on unreasonable amenity impacts on the residents to the south. That's it.
Thank you, Mr Sands, for coming and making that submission to us tonight. We very much appreciate your time.
Thanks.
Councillors, are there any questions? Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I just wanted to know through you to the officers, we've heard from the objector of what took place in relation to the consultations between the applicant and the objector. And I just want to know from the officers that facilitated that meeting, if they can make some comments on what took place in that meeting.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Over to you.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, there's been an exchange of information. Mr Sands has asked for details of screening and more information on colours and materials, and that's resulted in some additional plans being presented for his consideration. At the outset, they did say, whilst they're willing to listen to the concerns and consider some alternative treatments, they weren't prepared to go to the extent of removing levels of the building. This is level 3, 4, 5 above to accommodate a 30-degree setback. And Mr Sands has said and maintained throughout the meeting too that he's unwilling to see anything other than compliance with what's the stated requirement in DDO 17. There was certainly a conversation or a point raised by the planning officer to say, look, there's been some recent VCAT decisions on where a policy position might stand. But again, Mr Sands is fairly clear on the point that he thinks that there should be a 30-degree setback. I will say that usually when we require these sort of things, they're there to look at overshadowing those types of impacts. So they were discussed and explained as well and what they mean. The diagram that we circulated or provided at the last meeting was also discussed, where there are two levels fairly close to the site or to the objector's property, and then it then steps back, and then you've got a vertical rise with the next levels, and then it's those upper floors that encroach on that 30-degree setback. So there was a few days where there's a little bit of information and a few additional things asked for, and I've provided an email to councillors just providing some minutes of that particular meeting and what was agreed and what was discussed. And I've also provided what the officer's assessment is of the key issues that are being raised in terms of their specific amenity impacts.
Thank you, Mr Rudd. Are there any further questions? Councillor Greco?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, given the situation that we're in, is that whether the officers could entertain any sort of an amendment to accommodate for a 30-degree setback just on the section affecting the residents. My understanding is, from what I've just heard late this afternoon, is that that could not be accommodated. I just want to get a further explanation, because why that's important is that because it will leave us in a situation of whether accepting or just outright rejecting this whole application only for that particular possible variation.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Mr Rudd.
Thank you for the question. Mayor Rennie, there was certainly a clear message from the last planning committee for the permit applicant to take that very consideration on board. They certainly have said through the consultation meeting process, there's not a willingness to make that type of change. It is a considerable change at this late point. And for us to require that by a condition, we're not quite sure of the impacts of those particular changes, and we'd be saying that our recommendation would be, if we're insistent on a 30-degree setback, then we really should be looking at a refusal of the application.
Thank you, Mr Rudd. Councillors, are there further questions? No. Is there a motion? Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. I have an alternate motion which should appear up on the screen. Councillors, that's the motion. I think it was sent around later this afternoon. And that's a motion to refuse the application on those 5 grounds.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Is there a seconder for that motion? Councillor Williams. Councillor Greco.
Look, I won't linger on too much on this because it came to a previous council planning committee meeting. I think the central issue here is, as the objector has said, is in relation to the setback, the 30-degree versus the 45-degree setback, and it's really difficult because, you know, I suppose for us as councillors that we haven't been given a compromised position, or that a compromised position could not have been worked out through the consultation process that occurred between the applicant and the objector. I was really hopeful that they could come back with something that could accommodate and also help meet, in part, the planning objective of the 30-degree setback. Unfortunately, we've been put into a situation where we either accept the whole application or that we reject it in its totality. it's really a shame to reject it in its totality, because I think there are some good elements in relation to this application, particularly around the aged care facility that's envisaged for the area. But I think that given that we are, as a council, making a concession in relation to the setback, where we're allowing a 45-degree setback, I think it would have been incumbent on the applicant to provide some sort of concession and some sort of redesign to accommodate for the affected residents behind the development. We spent a lot of time in this council coming to terms with what those setbacks ought to be, that 30-degree setback, and I think part of that, coming to that determination, was to protect some of the adjacent residents, particularly with large developments of this nature. And I think in this particular case, we're making a concession but not receiving really adequate, if you like, compromise from the developer in terms of protecting the interest of particular residents. So on that basis, I'm putting forward this motion to unfortunately reject the application in its totality. That's the procedural process that we have to adhere to. It's a real shame that we have to reject the whole application. But I think that if council rejects this application and it were to go to VCAT, I think it would give the fresh eyes to look at this, and also give an opportunity both for the developer and the objector to further consider and try to as best meet the council's objectives in relation to the 30-degree setback.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor Williams.
Yes, this is another large development that's come to council, and this one has come back to us a couple of times. All I want to say particularly is that it also saddens me that we were only looking at a minor amendment, but yet the developer has only clearly shown that he wants this particular application, and it's all or nothing. I don't feel comfortable whether, it doesn't matter whether it's aged care, childcare or a kindy centre. It's important that we as a council, that we need to paramount that we look at the people who have to live in and around it, particularly those who live around it, because they will be looking at it every day for many years to come. It's easy for us to push a piece of paper aside and say, yep, we accept it or we refuse it, but it's important that we as a council look as a whole. As I said, it's very disappointing because it would have been nice to have seen some development to occur on this particular site, because it's been vacant for some time. I remember visiting it when it was at McDonald's, so we're going back some years ago now. Yeah, I'd hope that maybe that we could come to some sort of negotiation before it actually goes to VCAT, and that the applicant can actually rethink what has come about with my fellow councillor, with the grounds that he has laid out tonight.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Are there any further speakers? Councillor McCarthy.
I've got a question, actually. Just
Councillor McCarthy, the debate has commenced, so questions are no longer...
Well, can I just seek that it's not so much a question for understanding, but just to check that the wording has been checked by our officers, point 4 in particular.
Mr Rudd, can you comment? I'm not sure if you provided some assistance in drafting this.
Yes, through you, Mayor Randy, the wording has been checked.
Okay, thank you. Councillors, are there any further speakers? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That motion is carried. The Planning Committee has determined to give notice to refuse the planning permit. This decision may be appealed to VCAT. The applicant has 60 days in which to appeal. Councillors, thank you. That brings us to the end of the reports before us. We're now at other business. General plan information scheduled VCAT applications. The suggestion that the motion is that they be noted. That's moved by Councillor Amir, thank you, and seconded by Councillor Messina. All those in favour? That motion is carried. Consideration of reports considered confidential. There are none, so that therefore brings us to the close of the meeting. Thank you, councillors, for your time tonight, and thanks to all community members who came along.